The dust kicked up in thick clouds as Eleanor Pritchard's borrowed wagon rattled into Williamsburg, Virginia, in the early spring of 1872. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to change forever, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The town sprawled before her like a painting come to life, all wooden storefronts and dirt roads, with mountains rising in the blue distance beyond. She traveled 3 weeks from Philadelphia with her Aunt Margaret, a woman whose sharp tongue could cut through iron, and whose opinions about Eleanor's worth had been made abundantly clear during every mile of that journey. "Sit up straight," Aunt Margaret snapped, her bony elbow jabbing into Eleanor's ribs. "You slouch like a common field hand. How do you expect to catch a husband looking like that?" Eleanor straightened automatically, though she wanted nothing more than to remind her aunt that she hadn't asked to make this journey. Her parents had died 6 months prior in a factory fire that had taken 17 souls, leaving Eleanor orphaned at 22 with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small locket that had belonged to her mother. Aunt Margaret had grudgingly taken her in, but only with the understanding that Eleanor would marry the first suitable man who would have her. The wagon creaked to a stop outside the Williamsburg General Store, and Aunt Margaret descended with surprising agility for a woman of 57 years. Eleanor followed more slowly, her legs stiff from days of travel, her simple gray dress dusty and wrinkled despite her best efforts to keep presentable. She'd packed light because she owned little, and what she did own barely filled a single carpet bag. "You there," Aunt Margaret called to a man sweeping the storefront. "Where might I find the home of Mr. Thomas Wickham? I have correspondence with him regarding a marriage arrangement." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Marriage arrangement. Her aunt had been vague about their purpose in Williamsburg, mentioning only that opportunities awaited. Now the truth settled over Eleanor like a shroud. She was being sold off, passed from one reluctant caretaker to another. The man pointed down the main street. "Third house past the church, madam. Yellow shutters." They walked in silence, Eleanor's worn boots clicking against the wooden sidewalks. Williamsburg was smaller than Philadelphia but bustling with life. Cowboys and miners mixed with shopkeepers and farmers. Women in calico dresses carried baskets while children chased hoops down the street. In the distance, the Appalachian foothills rose like ancient guardians, their peaks still touched with winter snow. Thomas Wickham's house was modest but well kept, with a small garden out front where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Aunt Margaret rapped sharply on the door, and within moments, it swung open to reveal a thin man in his mid-40s with thinning hair and watery blue eyes. "Mrs. Haversham," he said, recognition lighting his features. "And this must be Eleanor." "Indeed," Aunt Margaret replied, pushing past him into the house without invitation. Eleanor followed more hesitantly, offering an apologetic smile that Mr. Wickham barely acknowledged. The parlor was cramped and dark, smelling of old tobacco and something vaguely medicinal. Mr. Wickham gestured for them to sit while he perched on the edge of a worn armchair, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. "Your letters indicated the girl was of good character and breeding," he began without preamble, "that she came from a respectable Philadelphia family." "Eleanor's father was a factory foreman," Aunt Margaret said quickly, "very respectable, and her mother came from good English stock." "Yes, yes," Mr. Wickham interrupted, waving his hand impatiently. "But you neglected to mention certain particulars in your correspondence, specifically the matter of her dowry." Aunt Margaret stiffened. "Eleanor is a healthy, capable young woman. She can cook, clean, and manage a household. Surely that is worth something." "Worth something, perhaps, but not sufficient for my needs. I am a man of business, Mrs. Haversham. I require a wife who can bring something to this union beyond basic domestic capabilities. My first wife, God rest her soul, brought $300 and her father's connections to the railroad. That investment helped establish my mercantile interests. Eleanor felt her cheeks burning. She was sitting right there, being discussed like a piece of livestock at auction. The humiliation of it made her throat tight, but she kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands and said nothing. What could she say? Everything Mr. Wickham said was true. She had nothing. "Surely we can come to some arrangement," Aunt Margaret said, and Eleanor heard the desperation creeping into her voice. Her aunt had traveled all this way expecting to unburden herself of an unwanted niece. Eleanor is young and strong. She could work, contribute to the household income. Mr. Wickham stood abruptly. "I was very clear in my letters, Mrs. Haversham. I require a wife who can bring capital to this marriage. Without a dowry, I simply cannot proceed with this arrangement. I am sorry you traveled all this way for nothing, but I must be practical about these matters." Aunt Margaret rose as well, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You might have made your requirements clearer, sir. Your letters were quite vague on the subject." "I assumed the matter of a dowry was understood between civilized people," Mr. Wickham replied coldly. He moved toward the door, clearly eager to have them gone. They found themselves back on the street moments later, Aunt Margaret practically vibrating with rage. "Insufferable man," she hissed. "How dare he waste our time like this?" "Perhaps we should return to Philadelphia," Eleanor suggested quietly, though the thought of the long journey back made her want to weep. "Absolutely not. I've spent good money getting us here, and I'll not throw it away. We'll find you a husband in this town if I have to knock on every door myself." And she did. Over the next 3 days, Aunt Margaret dragged Eleanor to every bachelor and widower in Williamsburg and the surrounding area. They visited a banker who took one look at Eleanor's plain dress and worn shoes and invented a prior engagement. They called on a doctor who questioned Eleanor extensively about her health and education before dismissing them both. A rancher seemed initially interested until Aunt Margaret mentioned the lack of dowry, at which point his enthusiasm evaporated like morning dew. With each rejection, Eleanor felt herself shrinking smaller and smaller. She began to dread the moment in every conversation when Aunt Margaret would admit the truth, and she would see the light die in yet another man's eyes. By the 4th day, she was seriously considering simply running away, though she had nowhere to run and no means to get there. "There's one more possibility," the general store owner told Aunt Margaret on the morning of the 5th day. "Quinn Fletcher. He's a mountain man, comes down from the hills every few weeks for supplies. Due in town today, matter of fact. He's been looking for a wife, or so I hear." A mountain man. Aunt Margaret's nose wrinkled as though she smelled something foul. "What sort of prospects could a mountain man offer?" the store owner shrugged. "He's got land up in the mountains, a good cabin from what I hear. Brings in quality furs and game, makes a decent living. And he's not particular about dowries and such. Mountain folk tend to be more practical about these things." Eleanor felt a small flutter of something that might have been hope. A mountain man certainly sounded better than another stuffy merchant or condescending banker. At least in the mountains she might find some peace and freedom. Aunt Margaret pursed her lips. "Very well. When does this Mr. Fletcher typically arrive?" "Should be here within the hour. He always stops here first to sell his furs." They waited on the bench outside the store, Aunt Margaret sitting stiff and disapproving while Eleanor watched the town go about its business. She found herself wondering what a mountain man would look like. In her mind, she pictured someone wild and rough, possibly frightening. But could he really be worse than the parade of cold-eyed men who had examined her like a horse with questionable teeth? When Quinn Fletcher finally appeared, walking down the main street with a pack mule laden with furs, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. He was nothing like she'd imagined. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His arms, visible beneath rolled-up sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back loosely with a leather cord. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but she could see strong features beneath it, a straight nose and deep-set eyes that she couldn't quite make out the color of from this distance. He moved with a confident, easy grace despite his size, and when he smiled at someone who called out a greeting, Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest. This was a man who looked comfortable in his own skin, who didn't put on airs or pretend to be something he wasn't. "That's him," the store owner said, stepping out onto the sidewalk. "Hey, Quinn, got someone here who wants to meet you." Quinn Fletcher approached, and Eleanor had to tilt her head back to look at him properly. His eyes, she discovered, were a startling green, like new leaves in spring. They swept over her and her aunt with casual interest but no judgment. "Morning, ladies," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Eleanor's bones. "I'm Quinn Fletcher. Folks call me Quinn." Aunt Margaret stood, drawing herself up to her full height, which still left her a good foot shorter than the mountain man. "I am Mrs. Margaret Haversham, and this is my niece, Eleanor Pritchard. I understand you might be seeking a wife, Mr. Fletcher." Quinn's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "I've been considering it. Gets lonely up in the mountains, and I'm not getting any younger. I'm 29 now, and I figure it's time to think about settling down, maybe starting a family. My niece is 22, of good character and excellent health. She can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. She would make any man an excellent wife." "I can speak for myself, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said quietly, surprising herself. She looked up at Quinn, feeling a strange courage in the face of his steady gaze. "But she's not wrong. I can do all those things. I'm also a hard worker and I learn quickly. What I lack in experience, I make up for in determination." Quinn's expression softened slightly and one corner of his mouth lifted. "That's good to know. What brings you to Williamsburg, Miss Pritchard?" "My parents died," Eleanor said simply. "I had nowhere else to go. I'm sorry for your loss." And he sounded like he meant it, which was more than most people had offered. "My own folks passed some years back. I know how hard that can be." Aunt Margaret cleared her throat impatiently. "Yes, well, that's all very touching, but we should discuss practicalities, Mr. Fletcher. My niece is willing to marry, but I must be honest with you. She has no dowry. Her parents left nothing, and I myself am not in a position to provide one." Eleanor braced herself for the familiar disappointment, the cooling of interest that always followed this announcement. She kept her eyes on the wooden planks of the sidewalk, not wanting to see rejection written across this man's face too, but Quinn just shrugged his massive shoulders. "She brings herself. That's enough wealth for me." Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" "I don't need money or land or fancy connections," Quinn said matter-of-factly. "I need a partner. Someone who can handle mountain life, who won't complain about the isolation or the hard work. If you're willing to try, Miss Pritchard, then that's all the dowry I require." Aunt Margaret looked stunned. "You're saying you'll marry her, just like that, without any financial consideration?" "Just like that," Quinn confirmed. He looked at Eleanor again, and this time she saw genuine warmth in those green eyes. "Though I reckon the lady should have some say in the matter. What do you think, Miss Pritchard? Would you be willing to take a chance on a mountain man?" Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, But these were different from the tears of humiliation she'd been fighting for days. These were tears of relief, of unexpected hope. "I would," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I would. Then we should probably talk a bit more, just the two of us, so you know what you're agreeing to." Quinn gestured down the street. "Would you walk with me, Miss Pritchard? With your aunt's permission, of course." Aunt Margaret waved her hand impatiently. "Yes, yes, go ahead. I'll wait here." They walked slowly down the main street, Quinn matching his long stride to Eleanor's shorter steps. He kept a respectful distance between them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I want to be honest with you," Quinn began. "Life in the mountains isn't easy. My cabin is comfortable enough, but it's rustic. We're a good 2 hours from town, and in winter, that journey can be dangerous. There are long stretches where you won't see another soul except me. It can be lonely and sometimes frightening. There are bears, wolves, harsh weather. You'd have to be strong and brave." "I can be strong," Eleanor said. "I worked in my father's household from the time I was young. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation. And I'd rather be lonely in the mountains with one kind person than surrounded by people in a city where no one truly cares if I live or die." Quinn glanced at her, something like admiration in his eyes. "Your aunt wasn't exaggerating about you speaking your mind. I hope that doesn't bother you." "Not at all. I value honesty." He paused, then continued. "I should also tell you that I don't expect you to be anything other than yourself. Some men take wives and try to mold them into something different. I'm not interested in that. You can be whoever you are, Eleanor. That's enough for me." They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land and the mountains rose majestically in the distance. Eleanor stopped, looking at those peaks with their snow-capped summits and feeling something shift inside her chest. "When would we marry?" she asked. "I was thinking tomorrow, if you're agreeable. The pastor here in Williamsburg can perform the ceremony. Then we'd head up to the cabin. I need to get back before the meat I've been smoking spoils. Tomorrow. It was so soon, so fast. But what was the alternative? Return to Philadelphia with Aunt Margaret and live as an unwanted burden. Face more rejections from men who saw her as a commodity rather than a person. Tomorrow would be fine, Eleanor said. They turned back toward the general store, and Eleanor felt Quinn's presence beside her like a warm fire on a cold night. He didn't try to touch her or speak honeyed words of false affection. He simply walked with her, solid and real, and somehow reassuring in his straightforward manner. Aunt Margaret was skeptical when they returned and announced their plans, but she couldn't hide her relief at having the problem of Eleanor solved so quickly and decisively. That evening, she paid for a room at the boarding house where they'd been staying and helped Eleanor prepare for the wedding the next day. "I still think you're making a mistake," Aunt Margaret said as she helped Eleanor brush out her long brown hair. "A mountain man. You could have held out for someone better." "Someone better hasn't appeared," Eleanor replied, "and I don't think Quinn is a poor choice. He seems kind." "Kind?" Aunt Margaret sniffed. "Kindness doesn't put food on the table. No, but hard work does, and I suspect Quinn knows plenty about that." The wedding took place the next morning in the small Williamsburg church, with the pastor, Aunt Margaret, and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she'd washed and pressed the night before. She'd woven wildflowers into her hair, picked that morning from the field behind the boarding house. Quinn arrived wearing clean clothes, his hair freshly washed and tied back, his beard trimmed neat. He looked nervous, which Eleanor found oddly endearing. This massive, capable man was nervous about marrying her. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Quinn took Eleanor's hand gently in his much larger one and squeezed it softly. The gesture was so tender that Eleanor felt her eyes welling up again. Afterward, there was no reception, no celebration. Quinn had already loaded Eleanor's carpetbag onto his mule along with his supplies. Aunt Margaret gave Eleanor a perfunctory hug and 50 cents, which was more than Eleanor had expected. "Try to make the best of it," Aunt Margaret said. Then she was boarding the noon stage back east, and Eleanor was climbing onto the mule behind Quinn's pack of supplies, her life in Philadelphia officially behind her. The journey into the mountains was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. They followed a narrow trail that wound upward through thick forest, the air growing cooler and cleaner as they climbed. Quinn walked ahead, leading the mule, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning Eleanor about low-hanging branches. "That's Eagle Ridge," he said, gesturing to a distinctive rock formation. "And over there is where I usually see deer in the morning. The creek runs year-round, even in the driest summers." Eleanor absorbed it all, trying to orient herself in this new landscape. Everything was so different from the cramped streets of Philadelphia. Here, the world seemed vast and wild and full of possibility. They stopped briefly at midday to rest and eat. Quinn produced bread, cheese, and dried meat from his pack, along with a canteen of cold water. They sat on a fallen log, and Eleanor was acutely aware of him beside her, this man who was now her husband. They'd known each other less than a day, and yet their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. "Are you scared?" Quinn asked suddenly. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "But not of you, more of the unknown, I suppose, of failing somehow." "You won't fail," Quinn said with such certainty that Eleanor almost believed him. "You're tougher than you think. I can see it in you." "How can you possibly know that?" "The way you stood up to your aunt. The way you agreed to all this without falling apart or having hysterics. The way you're handling this journey without complaint, even though I know you must be tired and sore." He smiled at her, and the expression transformed his face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "You've got spine, Eleanor Fletcher. That's worth more than gold up here." Eleanor Fletcher. The name sounded strange to her ears, but not unpleasant. She was a Fletcher now, married to this mountain man, heading toward a life she couldn't have imagined a week ago. They reached the cabin in late afternoon. It sat in a clearing carved out of the forest, with a small garden plot to one side and a lean-to stable for the mule. The cabin itself was larger than Eleanor had expected, built from sturdy logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, which confused her until Quinn explained that he'd banked the fire before leaving. "Come on," he said, helping her down from the mule. "Let me show you your new home." Inside, the cabin was dim but surprisingly cozy. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a bearskin rug on the floor. A ladder led to a loft above, which Quinn explained was where he slept. There was also a small back room that he used for storage. "It's not much," Quinn said, and Eleanor heard uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. Compared to the cramped, dark rooms she'd shared with Aunt Margaret in Philadelphia, this cabin felt spacious and filled with light from the windows Quinn had cut into the walls. "Thank you for bringing me here." Quinn relaxed visibly. "I'll get your things and tend to the mule. You should look around, get familiar with where everything is. I imagine you'll want to rest after the journey." But Eleanor didn't want to rest. She was energized by the newness of everything, eager to begin establishing herself in this space. While Quinn was outside, she explored the cabin thoroughly, noting where he kept food, cooking supplies, and tools. She found his system logical and well-organized, which pleased her. She'd half expected a bachelor's chaos. When Quinn returned, he found her examining the fireplace, clearly trying to figure out how to adjust the cooking pot that hung from an iron hook. "It swings out," he said, demonstrating. "Makes it easier to tend whatever you're cooking without burning yourself." "That's clever." "I didn't invent it," Quinn said with a shrug. "But it works well enough." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, the reality of their situation settling over them. They were married, alone together in this cabin, essentially strangers. Quinn cleared his throat. "Listen, Eleanor. I know this is all very sudden and strange. I don't expect anything from you beyond companionship and partnership. The loft is mine, but I can sleep down here by the fire. You should have the bed. We can take things slow, get to know each other properly." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that more than you know." "I figured you would," Quinn said. "Now I need to check my traps before dark. Will you be all right here alone for an hour or so? I'll be fine. I thought I might start preparing something for dinner." Quinn showed her where he kept the vegetables from his root cellar and the dried herbs he'd gathered. He suggested a stew, which would be simple enough and could cook while he was gone. Then he grabbed his rifle and headed out, leaving Eleanor alone in her new home. She worked steadily, peeling potatoes and carrots, cutting up some of the dried venison Quinn had pointed out. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the man she'd married. He was nothing like she'd expected. His size and appearance suggested roughness, but he'd been nothing but gentle and considerate with her. He could have insisted on his marital rights, could have treated her as property he'd acquired. Instead, he'd offered her space and time, asking nothing in return. When Quinn returned, he brought fresh rabbit, which he quickly skinned and added to the stew. He worked efficiently beside Eleanor in the small cooking area, their movements gradually synchronizing. It felt strangely domestic, almost comfortable. They ate in companionable silence as the sun set beyond the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took Eleanor's breath away. She'd never seen a sunset like this, unobscured by buildings and smoke. "I could never get tired of that view," she said, standing at the window. Quinn joined her, looking out at the fading light. "I don't think I ever have. Every sunset is different up here. Every sunrise, too." That night, Quinn made good on his promise, settling down by the fire with extra blankets while Eleanor climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was simple but comfortable, stuffed with what she assumed was straw or dried grass and covered with furs and quilts. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, acutely aware of Quinn's presence below. She had done it. She had escaped Philadelphia, escaped the endless rejections and humiliations. She was married now to a man who seemed decent and kind. Whatever happened next, at least she had this: a roof over her head, food in her belly, and someone who had chosen her not despite her lack of dowry, but because he valued her for herself. It was more than she dared to hope for. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She dressed quickly and climbed down to find Quinn at the stove, cooking breakfast with the same efficient competence he seemed to bring to everything. "Morning," he said with a smile. "Hope I didn't wake you." "I'm usually up with the sun. It's fine. I should be up helping." Eleanor joined him, noting where he kept the dishes and setting the table for breakfast. They fell into an easy routine over the following days. Quinn would rise early to tend to his traps and check on the animals in the forest. Eleanor would work in the cabin, cleaning, cooking, and beginning to organize things in a way that made sense to her. In the afternoons, Quinn would work on various projects around the cabin, and often Eleanor would join him, learning about life in the mountains. He taught her how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track animals by their prints in the dirt. She proved an eager student, asking questions and practicing the skills he shared. Quinn seemed pleased by her interest and enthusiasm. "You're taking to this better than I expected," he admitted one afternoon as they worked together in the garden plot preparing it for spring planting. "I like it here," Eleanor said simply. "It's peaceful, and I like learning new things. Your aunt didn't seem to think much of mountain life." "My aunt doesn't think much of anything that doesn't involve society and respectability." Eleanor sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "She would have preferred I marry some merchant in Philadelphia and spend my days pouring tea for other merchants' wives." The idea of me being happy never factored into her plans. "And are you?" Quinn asked quietly. "Happy, I mean." Eleanor considered the question. "I think I could be," she said carefully. "It's still all very new, and I know we're still getting to know each other. But yes, I think happiness is possible here." Quinn smiled, and Eleanor felt that now familiar warmth in her chest. Over the past week, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to her husband. He was kind without being soft, strong without being brutish. He respected her opinions and listened when she spoke. He made her laugh with his dry observations about the forest animals and his self-deprecating humor, and she couldn't deny that she found him attractive. His size had initially intimidated her, but now she saw the beauty in his strength, in the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he chopped wood or carried heavy supplies. His hands, calloused and large, were surprisingly gentle when he helped her over rough terrain or handed her delicate seedlings to plant. She caught herself watching him more and more, wondering what it would be like to truly be his wife in every sense, to close the careful distance they'd maintained. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival at the cabin, a spring storm rolled through the mountains. Thunder crashed overhead and rain hammered against the roof. Eleanor had never experienced a storm like this, where the whole world seemed to shake with the force of nature's fury. She was trying not to show her fear, sitting at the table and working on mending one of Quinn's shirts by lamplight. But when a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, she jumped, the needle slipping and pricking her finger. "It's all right," Quinn said, looking up from where he was oiling his rifle. "The cabin has weathered worse storms than this. We're safe here." "I know," Eleanor said, sucking on her injured finger. "It's just so loud." Quinn set aside his rifle and moved to sit across from her. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said. "What was it like growing up there?" Eleanor understood what he was doing, trying to distract her from the storm. She appreciated the kindness of it. "Crowded," she said, "and dirty. But there were good things too. My father used to take me to the park on Sundays, and my mother taught me to read using books from the public library. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough." "You must miss them terribly." "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "The fire happened so fast. One moment everything was normal, and the next the whole building was engulfed. They never had a chance." Her voice broke slightly, and she felt tears threatening. Quinn reached across the table and took her hand in his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. The gesture was so comforting that Eleanor felt herself leaning into him. "I'm sorry you lost them," Quinn said. "I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." "I'm not alone now," Eleanor whispered. She looked up, meeting his green eyes across the table. "Am I?" "No," Quinn said firmly. "You're not alone. You have me, for whatever that's worth. It's worth a great deal to me." They sat like that, hands joined across the table while the storm raged outside. Eleanor felt something shifting between them, the careful distance they'd maintained beginning to dissolve. She didn't pull her hand away, and neither did Quinn. When the storm finally passed, leaving the forest dripping and fresh-smelling, Eleanor stood to bank the fire for the night. Quinn rose as well, and they found themselves standing close together in the small space. "Eleanor," Quinn began, then paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "These past 2 weeks have been good, better than good. I feel like I've known you longer than I have, and I want you to know that I'm glad you're here, glad you took a chance on me." "I'm glad too," Eleanor said. She reached up, surprising herself with her boldness, and touched his face, feeling the softness of his beard against her palm. "You're a good man, Quinn Fletcher, better than I had any right to hope for." Quinn turned his face into her palm, his eyes closing briefly. When he opened them again, Eleanor saw desire there, carefully banked but unmistakable. Her breath caught. "I don't want to rush you," Quinn said, his voice rough. "But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want more than this careful distance we've been keeping. You're my wife, Eleanor. I want to be your husband in truth if you'll have me." Eleanor's heart was pounding, but not from fear. "Yes," she said simply. "I want that too." Quinn cupped her face in his large hands, tilting her head up to look at him. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, Eleanor rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, exploratory, but it quickly deepened. Quinn's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Eleanor melted into his embrace. He was so big, so strong, but he held her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "Wife," he murmured, and Eleanor heard wonder in his voice. "Husband," she replied, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. That night, Quinn climbed the ladder to the loft with her, and they became husband and wife in truth. He was gentle and patient, attentive to her inexperience and nervous responses. By the time the moonlight was streaming through the loft window, Eleanor lay curled against Quinn's broad chest, feeling safe and cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Quinn's voice rumbled in his chest beneath her ear. "For seeing me, for choosing me, for not caring about the dowry." Quinn's arms tightened around her. "I told you before, you're all the wealth I need. I meant that, Eleanor. You're worth more than all the gold in California." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and joy and something that might have been love, or at least the beginning of it. The weeks passed, spring sliding into early summer. Eleanor grew more confident in her role as Quinn's wife and partner. She learned to shoot his rifle, though she wasn't as accurate as him. She learned to fish in the creek that ran near the cabin and to preserve the fish they caught. She learned to make soap from ashes and fat, to churn butter, to smoke meat. Quinn, in turn, proved to be an attentive and affectionate husband. He brought her wildflowers when he found them on his trap runs. He built her a rocking chair for the porch, carved with intricate designs of leaves and animals. He listened to her ideas about improving the cabin and the garden, and they worked together to implement them. They made love often, growing more comfortable with each other's bodies, learning what brought pleasure. Eleanor discovered that she was a passionate woman when given the chance, and Quinn seemed delighted by this revelation. One evening in early June, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor tucked into Quinn's side, his arm around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," Quinn said slowly, "about expanding the cabin, adding a room or two." "That would be nice," Eleanor agreed, "though I'm curious why the sudden interest." "Well," Quinn said, and she heard a smile in his voice, "I figured we might need more space eventually, if things go the way I hope they will." Eleanor turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've noticed you've been tired lately, and you haven't had your monthly courses since you arrived." Eleanor felt her face flush. She had noticed the absence of her courses, but had attributed it to the stress of her recent life changes. But combined with the fatigue and the slight queasiness she'd been experiencing in the mornings, There was really only one explanation. "You think I might be with child," she whispered. "I think it's possible," Quinn said carefully. "How do you feel about that?" Eleanor took stock of her emotions. Surprise, certainly, fear of the unknown, but underneath it all, a bubbling excitement. "I think I'd be happy," she said slowly. "A little scared, but happy. What about you?" Quinn pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'd be over the moon," he admitted. "I've wanted a family for a long time. I just never thought I'd find the right woman to build one with. And then you appeared in Williamsburg, and everything changed." "I can't believe it's only been 2 months since we met," Eleanor said. "It feels like I've known you my whole life." "Time moves different in the mountains," Quinn said. "Everything is distilled down to what matters. There's no room for pretense or false courtesy up here. We've gotten to know each other's true selves, and we've done it fast." Over the next few weeks, it became increasingly clear that Eleanor was indeed pregnant. Her morning sickness became more pronounced, and her body began to change in small but noticeable ways. Quinn was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more and take on fewer physical tasks. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," Eleanor protested one morning when Quinn tried to stop her from carrying water from the creek. "I know, but humor me," Quinn said, taking the bucket from her hands. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are healthy." Eleanor softened. "I appreciate your concern, but I need to stay active. Women have been having babies while working for thousands of years." "Not my woman having my baby," Quinn countered. "At least let me do the heavy lifting." They compromised, with Eleanor continuing her daily tasks but allowing Quinn to handle anything particularly strenuous. It was a testament to how well they'd learned to work together that they managed to find this balance without major conflict. In late July, they made the journey down to Williamsburg, so Eleanor could see a doctor, and they could stock up on supplies for the winter. The trip was slower than usual, with Quinn insisting on frequent rest stops, but Eleanor didn't mind. The forest was beautiful in summer, and she enjoyed the time alone with her husband. In town, the doctor confirmed what they already knew and pronounced Eleanor healthy and strong. He estimated the baby would arrive in late February or early March. They celebrated with dinner at the boarding house restaurant, a luxury they rarely indulged in. "To us," Quinn said, raising his glass of water. "To our family." "To our family," Eleanor echoed, clinking her glass against his. As they prepared to leave town the next morning, they encountered Aunt Margaret on the street. Eleanor hadn't seen or heard from her aunt since the wedding, and the sight of her stirred complicated emotions. "Eleanor," Aunt Margaret said, looking her up and down critically, "you look well." "Country life must agree with you." "It does," Eleanor said simply. "How are you, Aunt Margaret?" "Well enough. I'm staying with the Wickhams while I visit old friends in the area." Her eyes shifted to Quinn, who stood protectively close to Eleanor. "Mr. Fletcher." "Madam," Quinn acknowledged with a nod. Aunt Margaret's gaze dropped to Eleanor's belly, which was just beginning to show beneath her dress. "I see you've wasted no time starting a family." Eleanor felt Quinn tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "We're very happy about the baby," she said firmly. "Quinn is going to be a wonderful father." "I'm sure," Aunt Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Well, I won't keep you. I imagine you're eager to return to your mountain." As they walked away, Quinn muttered, "That woman has all the warmth of a January blizzard." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "She can't help it. She's bitter about her own life, and it makes her cruel to others." "Well, she was wrong about you needing a dowry," Quinn said. "You've brought nothing but richness to my life." Eleanor squeezed his hand, grateful once again for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The summer passed peacefully, with Eleanor's belly growing round and Quinn fussing over her like a mother hen. He'd begun the cabin expansion, adding a room that would serve as a nursery. Eleanor helped where she could, sewing curtains and blankets, preparing for their child's arrival. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Quinn's hand resting on Eleanor's belly, feeling the baby kick and move. "I hope it's a boy," Quinn said one night. "A son to teach everything I know, to pass the cabin and the land on to." "And what if it's a girl?" Eleanor teased. "Then I'll teach her anyway," Quinn said with a grin. "A daughter needs to know how to take care of herself in this world. Besides, I wouldn't mind having a little girl who looks like her beautiful mother." Eleanor blushed, still not quite used to Quinn's casual compliments. "I think I'd like a boy first, someone strong like his father." "Either way, we'll love them," Quinn said, leaning in to kiss her. "That's what matters." Winter came early to the mountains that year, with the first snow falling in mid-October. Quinn had prepared well, stocking the cabin with supplies and firewood, ensuring they could weather any storm. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, she found herself grateful for the cozy cabin, the warm fire, and Quinn's steady presence. The isolation that had initially worried her became a blessing. She and Quinn grew even closer, spending long winter evenings talking, playing cards, reading aloud from the few books they owned. Quinn proved to be an excellent storyteller, regaling Eleanor with tales of his adventures in the mountains, the people he'd met, the dangers he'd faced. In turn, Eleanor shared more about her childhood, her parents, her dreams for the future. They talked about how they wanted to raise their children, what values they wanted to instill. They discovered they agreed on most things, both valuing honesty, hard work, and kindness. "I want our children to know they're loved," Eleanor said one night as they lay in bed, Quinn's hand resting on her very pregnant belly. "I want them to feel safe and valued no matter what." "They will," Quinn promised. "We'll make sure of it." In late February, as a winter storm raged outside, Eleanor went into labor. Quinn, who had delivered foals and calves, found himself terrified when faced with his wife's pain. But Eleanor remained calm, talking him through what needed to happen, drawing on knowledge passed down from her mother and the doctor's instructions. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Quinn held Eleanor's hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, encouraged her when she grew tired. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You're the strongest woman I know, you can do this." And she did. As the storm cleared and watery sunlight broke through the clouds, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Quinn caught his son in his large, steady hands, tears streaming down his face as the baby let out his first lusty cry. "He's perfect," Quinn whispered, carefully placing the baby on Eleanor's chest. "You're both perfect." Eleanor looked down at her son, this tiny miracle, and felt love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "Welcome to the world." They named him Samuel, after Quinn's father, and he proved to be a strong, healthy child with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair. Quinn was a devoted father, doting on his son while still caring for Eleanor as she recovered from the birth. Those early weeks were exhausting, with Samuel waking every few hours to nurse and seemingly content only when being held. But they were also magical, as Eleanor and Quinn learned to be parents together, figuring things out through trial and error and lots of laughter. "I had no idea something so small could produce such enormous messes," Quinn observed one afternoon while changing Samuel's diaper. Eleanor laughed from where she sat nursing the baby. "You're doing wonderfully, for a man who's more comfortable with bear traps than babies." "I'll get the hang of it," Quinn said determinedly. "I'm not letting you do all the work." As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it new life and warm sunshine, Eleanor took stock of her life. Just over a year ago, she'd been in Williamsburg, desperate and dowryless, certain that her life was essentially over. Now she stood in the doorway of her mountain cabin, her husband chopping wood nearby, their son sleeping in a cradle Quinn had carved with his own hands. She had no dowry, no money, no fine connections, but she had everything that truly mattered. She had love, family, and a home. She had a partner who valued her for herself, not for what she could bring to a marriage. She had a future filled with possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Quinn asked, coming to stand beside her, Samuel cradled in his arms. "How lucky I am," Eleanor said simply. "How grateful." Quinn smiled, that warm expression that never failed to make her heart skip. "I'm the lucky one. The day you walked into my life was the best day I'd ever had." "Even though I had no dowry," Eleanor teased. Quinn looked at her, his expression serious. "Especially because you had no dowry. It meant you came to me for the right reasons. Not for money or security or anything material, just for me and for the chance at a life together. That's worth more than all the gold in the world." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him, careful not to disturb Samuel sleeping between them. "I love you, Quinn Fletcher. Thank you for seeing my worth when no one else did." "I love you too, Eleanor Fletcher. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." The years passed in a blur of happiness, punctuated by the usual challenges of mountain life. When Samuel was 2, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Quinn's mother. She had Eleanor's brown eyes and Quinn's determination, and she kept them all on their toes from the moment she learned to walk. 2 years after Rose came another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings, but equally beloved. Quinn expanded the cabin again to accommodate their growing family, adding another bedroom and a larger kitchen. Eleanor proved to be an excellent mother, patient and loving, but also firm when necessary. She taught their children to read and write, using the books Quinn brought back from his trips to Williamsburg. She taught them about plants and animals, about respecting nature and living in harmony with the land. Quinn taught them practical skills, how to track and hunt, how to fish and trap, how to survive in the wilderness. But he also taught them gentleness, how to care for injured animals, how to help their neighbors, how to be honest and kind. The children grew up wild and free, climbing trees and exploring the forest under their parents' watchful eyes. They were confident and capable, knowing they were loved unconditionally. Sometimes, when the children were asleep and Eleanor and Quinn sat on their porch watching the stars, they would talk about that day in Williamsburg when they'd first met. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one night. "Taking a chance on a woman with no dowry?" Quinn pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Not for a single second. You've given me everything I ever wanted. A home filled with love and laughter, children who make me proud every day, a partner who makes life an adventure. What could I possibly regret?" "I worried at first," Eleanor admitted, "that you'd come to resent me, that you'd wish you'd married someone who could have brought money or connections." "Eleanor, look at me." Quinn waited until she met his eyes. "You brought yourself, your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, your love. That's the greatest wealth anyone could ask for. Everything good in my life comes from the day I decided to marry you. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I'm so grateful your path crossed mine that day. I was so lost, so convinced I had no value. You showed me I was wrong." "You always had value," Quinn corrected gently. "I just helped you see it." In the summer of 1882, when Samuel was 10 and already showing signs of becoming as tall and broad as his father, they made a family trip to Williamsburg. The town had grown in the decade since Eleanor had first arrived, with new buildings and more people. but the general store still stood, run now by the original owner's son. As they walked down the main street, Eleanor holding James's hand while Rose skipped ahead and Samuel walked with Quinn, she spotted a familiar figure. Aunt Margaret had aged considerably, her hair now completely gray, her face lined with bitterness. She stood outside the boarding house and her eyes widened when she recognized Eleanor. "Eleanor, is that you?" "Hello, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said pleasantly. She gestured to her family. "This is my husband Quinn, and our children Samuel, Rose, and James." Aunt Margaret's gaze swept over them, taking in the children's healthy, happy faces, the obvious affection between Eleanor and Quinn, the quality of their clothes and supplies. "You've done well for yourself," she said, and Eleanor heard surprise in her voice. "I'd heard rumors, but I didn't quite believe them. They say your husband is one of the most successful fur trappers in the region." "Quinn works hard," Eleanor said simply. "We all do. But we're happy, and that's what matters most." "And to think," Aunt Margaret said, shaking her head, "you did all this without a dowry." Eleanor smiled, reaching for Quinn's hand. "I had the only dowry that mattered. I had myself, and Quinn recognized that was enough." Quinn squeezed her hand, pride evident in his expression. Samuel, who'd heard the story of his parents meeting many times, looked up at his father with admiration. "Papa says Mama is the best thing that ever happened to him," Samuel announced. "He says she's worth more than all the gold in California." Aunt Margaret's expression softened slightly, perhaps the first genuine emotion Eleanor had ever seen from her. "Perhaps I was wrong about a great many things," she said quietly. "You seem very happy, Eleanor." "I am," Eleanor said. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." They parted ways cordially, and Eleanor felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She'd proven something to her aunt, but more importantly, she'd proven it to herself. She'd taken a leap of faith with Quinn, and it had led to a life beyond her wildest dreams. That evening they camped by a creek on the way back to the cabin. Quinn built a fire while Eleanor prepared dinner, and the children played nearby, catching fireflies and laughing. "I'm glad we went to town," Eleanor said as she and Quinn sat by the fire, watching their children play. "It reminded me of how far we've come." "We've built something good," Quinn agreed. "Something real and lasting." Rose came running up, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "Mama, I picked these for you." Eleanor accepted the flowers with a smile. "Thank you, sweetheart, they're beautiful." "Like you, Mama," Rose said seriously. "Papa says you're the most beautiful woman in the whole world." Eleanor laughed, meeting Quinn's eyes across the fire. "Your papa is biased." "Papa's right," Samuel chimed in, joining them with James trailing behind. "Miss Martha at the general store said Papa was smart to marry you even without a dowry. She said you're worth 10 fancy city ladies." "Miss Martha said that?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "She did," Quinn confirmed. "I ran into her while you were at the seamstress. She said the whole town knows our story, how I married you for love instead of money. Apparently it's become something of a legend around here." Eleanor felt herself blushing. "That seems rather dramatic." "Maybe," Quinn said, pulling her close, "but it's true. I did marry you for love, and it's the best decision I ever made." They settled the children for sleep in the tent Quinn had set up, then sat together by the dying fire, Eleanor leaning against Quinn's solid warmth. "You think our children will understand someday?" Eleanor asked. "How unusual our story was. I think they'll understand that love matters more than money," Quinn said. "That character matters more than connections. That's a good lesson for them to learn." "I want them to marry for love," Eleanor said. "To find partners who value them for who they are, not what they have." "They will," Quinn assured her. "We're raising them to know their worth. They'll never settle for less than they deserve." Eleanor tilted her head up to look at the stars, visible through gaps in the forest canopy. They seemed to shine brighter up here in the mountains, away from town lights and smoke. Each star was a point of hope, of possibility. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For everything. For choosing me. For building this life with me. For loving me so completely." Quinn tightened his arms around her. "Eleanor, loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done. You make it effortless." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek burbling nearby and the soft breathing of their children in the tent. This was peace, Eleanor thought. This was home. Not the cabin itself, but wherever Quinn and their children were. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones. Samuel grew into a man much like his father, tall and strong and kind. He fell in love with a girl from Williamsburg, a farmer's daughter who didn't care that Samuel was a mountain man's son. They married in the same church where Quinn and Eleanor had wed, and Eleanor cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. Rose proved to be fierce and independent, learning everything her father could teach her about surviving in the wilderness. She eventually became a guide, one of the few women in the profession, leading hunters and travelers through the mountains. She never married, claiming she was too in love with the freedom of the mountains to settle down, and her parents supported her choice. James, the quietest of their children, showed an aptitude for medicine. Quinn and Eleanor scraped together the money to send him to school in Richmond, where he studied to become a doctor. He returned to the mountains to practice, serving the scattered communities that dotted the hills and valleys. Quinn and Eleanor grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the mountains themselves. But their love never faded. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming richer and more complex. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Quinn and Eleanor stood on their porch, looking out at the view they'd shared for 3 decades. Their children were grown and gone, though they visited often with grandchildren in tow. The cabin was quiet now, but it was a comfortable quiet filled with memories. 30 years, Eleanor mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we met in Williamsburg. Other times it feels like we've always been together. "I know what you mean," Quinn said. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He was 60 now, his body showing the wear of years of hard work, but he was still strong, still her mountain man. "I can barely remember what life was like before you." "Lonelier, I imagine," Eleanor said with a smile. "Much lonelier," Quinn agreed. "You filled spaces in my life I didn't even know were empty." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I still remember what you said that day, when Aunt Margaret announced I had no dowry and you said I brought myself, and that was enough wealth." "I meant every word," Quinn said. "You were enough then and you're enough now. You'll always be enough, Eleanor." "You saved me," Eleanor whispered. "I was so lost, so convinced I had no value. You showed me I was wrong." "You saved me too," Quinn countered. "I was so isolated up here, convinced I'd spend my life alone. Then you appeared, brave and beautiful, willing to take a chance on a rough mountain man. You made my life complete." They stood together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. This view, this moment, this love, it was everything Eleanor had never dared to dream of on that dusty day in Williamsburg so many years ago. "I'd do it all again," she said. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I'd choose you every time." "And I'd choose you," Quinn said, kissing her softly. "Every time, without hesitation. You're my greatest treasure, Eleanor Fletcher. My wealth beyond measure." As the stars began to appear overhead, one by one, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, from Philadelphia orphan to mountain wife and mother. From a woman with no dowry to a woman rich in all the ways that truly mattered. She had love. She had family. She had a lifetime of memories with a man who had valued her when the world said she was worthless. She had children and grandchildren who carried her love forward into the future. She had everything, and it had all started with a mountain man who understood a simple truth that so many others had missed. The greatest wealth a person could bring to a marriage was themselves. Their heart, their spirit, their willingness to build a life together. Eleanor had brought herself, and for Quinn, that had been more than enough. It had been everything. As they headed inside for the evening, Quinn's hand warm in hers, Eleanor sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For second chances, for unexpected blessings, for a love that had grown and endured through 3 decades of mountain life. She was the woman with no dowry who had found the richest life imaginable, and she wouldn't have changed a single moment of it. The years continued their steady march, bringing with them both joy and sorrow. Quinn's hair turned completely white, and Eleanor's hands grew gnarled with arthritis. But they remained devoted to each other, their love a constant in a changing world. Samuel brought his own children to visit, 5 strong grandchildren who ran wild through the forest just as their father had. Rose would appear without warning, staying for a few days before vanishing back into the mountains, always with stories of her latest adventures. James wrote letters from his practice, telling them about the people he'd helped, the lives he'd saved. Quinn and Eleanor took pride in what they'd built together. Not just the cabin and the land, but the legacy of love and respect they'd passed to their children. They'd shown them that true wealth had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with character and love. On a crisp autumn morning in 1902, when the mountains were ablaze with fall color, Quinn woke to find Eleanor still sleeping beside him. For a moment, panic seized him. She was so still, but then he saw the gentle rise and fall of her breathing and relaxed. He studied her face in the early morning light filtering through the window. Even at 72, she was beautiful to him. Every line, every gray hair, every mark of age was precious because it represented their life together. The laughter lines around her eyes spoke of joy shared. The silver in her hair spoke of wisdom earned. The weathered skin of her hands spoke of hard work done side by side. As if sensing his gaze, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She smiled when she saw him watching her. "Good morning, husband," she murmured, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, wife," Quinn replied. He reached out to tuck a strand of gray hair behind her ear. "Have I told you lately that I love you? You tell me every day," Eleanor said, turning her face into his palm, "but I never tire of hearing it. I love you, Eleanor Fletcher, today, tomorrow, and always. And I love you, Quinn Fletcher, with everything I am." They rose slowly, their aged bodies protesting the movement, and began their morning routine. It was slower now than it used to be, punctuated with more rest breaks and groans of complaint about aching joints. But they managed, helping each other when needed, patient with each other's limitations. After breakfast, they sat on the porch as was their custom, watching the forest wake up around them. A family of deer grazed in the clearing. Birds sang in the trees. The creek babbled its eternal song in the distance. "It's a good life," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We've had a good life, haven't we? The best," Quinn agreed. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture repeated thousands of times over 30 years. "I have no regrets, Eleanor, not a single one." "Neither do I," Eleanor said. She looked at their joined hands, seeing the way they fit together perfectly despite the wrinkles and age spots. "We were meant to find each other. I truly believe that. The universe conspired to bring us together that day in Williamsburg." "I'm grateful it did," Quinn said. "Every day I'm grateful." They sat in silence again, but it was the silence of two people so comfortable with each other that words weren't always necessary. They could communicate volumes in a glance, a touch, a smile. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Quinn thought about all the years they'd spent in this place, all the sunrises and sunsets they'd witnessed, all the storms weathered and challenges overcome, all the moments of joy and laughter that had filled their home. He thought about the day he'd met Eleanor, how something in her eyes had called to him. She'd been lost and afraid, but underneath that he'd seen strength and determination. He'd seen a kindness that drew him in. He'd seen a woman worth knowing, worth loving, worth building a life with. The lack of a dowry had never mattered to him. He'd grown up poor, had built his life in these mountains through hard work and determination. He understood that true value had nothing to do with money. And he'd recognized Eleanor's value immediately, even if the rest of the world had been blind to it. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, noticing his faraway expression. "About how lucky I am," Quinn said simply. "About how one decision changed my entire life. If I hadn't gone to Williamsburg that day, if I hadn't listened to the store owner's suggestion, I would have missed you. I would have lived my whole life never knowing what it was like to truly love someone, to be truly loved in return." "I think about that too sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "All the little things that had to happen for us to meet. If my parents hadn't died, if Aunt Margaret hadn't brought me to Williamsburg, if that awful Mr. Wickham had agreed to marry me, I would have missed you too. And my life would have been so much poorer for it." "We were meant to be," Quinn said firmly. "I believe that with everything in me." The afternoon brought a visit from Rose, who arrived with a string of fish and stories about a close encounter with a black bear. She stayed for dinner, regaling them with tales that made Eleanor gasp and Quinn laugh. "You be careful out there," Eleanor scolded gently. "You're not as young as you used to be." Rose, now 40 years old, grinned. "I'm still spry enough, Mama, and besides, Papa taught me everything I need to know about dealing with bears." "That I did," Quinn said proudly. "But your mother's right. No need to take unnecessary risks." After Rose left, disappearing into the forest as suddenly as she'd arrived, Quinn and Eleanor prepared for bed. They moved slowly through their evening routine, banking the fire, checking the doors, climbing the ladder to their loft bedroom. As they lay in bed, Eleanor curled against Quinn's side as she had for 30 years. She found herself thinking about legacy. What would they leave behind when they were gone? The cabin would likely go to Samuel, who'd expressed interest in keeping it in the family. The land would remain wild and beautiful, a testament to the life they'd built. But more than that, they would leave love. Their children knew what real love looked like because they'd witnessed it every day of their lives. Their grandchildren would hear stories about the mountain man who married a woman with no dowry because he understood that true wealth came from the heart. "Quinn," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "Yes, love, thank you for the life you gave me. Thank you for seeing my worth when no one else did. Thank you for 30 years of love and partnership and joy." Quinn pulled her closer, his lips pressing against her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man. Thank you for filling my life with more love than I ever dreamed possible." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts beating in synchrony. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. The seasons continued their endless cycle, bringing Quinn and Eleanor into their twilight years with grace. They grew frailer, their movements slower, but their love remained as strong as ever. Samuel visited often, sometimes bringing his whole family to help with chores and maintenance. James made the journey from his practice several times a year to check on their health. Even Rose, wild and free as she was, came by more frequently, staying longer each time. Quinn turned 80 in 1912, and Eleanor organized a celebration with all their children and grandchildren present. The cabin overflowed with people and laughter, reminding Quinn of all the years when their own children had filled these rooms with noise and energy. As he looked around at his family-grown children with gray streaking their own hair, grandchildren ranging from infants to young adults, Quinn felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what mattered. This legacy of love, this family bound together by affection and respect. Eleanor found him standing in the doorway, watching the gathering with tears in his eyes. "What's wrong, love?" she asked, concerned. "Nothing's wrong," Quinn assured her, pulling her close. "Everything's right. Look at what we created, Eleanor. Look at all these people who exist because we found each other, because we chose love over practicality." Eleanor followed his gaze, seeing their family through his eyes. "We did good, didn't we?" "We did better than good," Quinn said. "We did magnificently." The party continued late into the evening, with music and dancing and storytelling. The grandchildren begged for the story of how their grandparents met, and Eleanor obliged, telling it with the practiced ease of someone who'd told it many times before. "Your grandfather was the first person who saw me for who I really was," she concluded. "Not for what I could provide or what family I came from, but for me, and that made all the difference. You loved Grandma even though she was poor," one of the younger grandchildren asked Quinn innocently. "I didn't love your grandmother despite anything," Quinn corrected gently. "I loved her because of who she was. Her kindness, her strength, her spirit. Those things have nothing to do with money. They're what make a person truly rich." The grandchildren nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom, and Quinn hoped they would carry it forward into their own lives. As the years advanced further, Quinn and Eleanor found themselves slowing down more and more. Simple tasks that had once been easy now required effort and planning. But they adapted, helping each other, never complaining about the limitations age imposed. One spring morning in 1915, Quinn woke to find Eleanor struggling to breathe. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, and panic seized him. "I'm getting James," he said, moving faster than he had in years. "Hold on, Eleanor, just hold on." Samuel, who had taken to staying at the cabin more often to help his aging parents, rode hard to fetch his brother. James arrived within hours, his medical bag in hand, his face grave as he examined his mother. "Her heart is failing," he told Quinn privately. "I can make her comfortable, but there's not much more I can do. I'm sorry, Pa." Quinn felt his own heart breaking. He'd known this day would come eventually, had tried to prepare himself for it, but nothing could truly prepare a person for the prospect of losing their other half. He spent the next days at Eleanor's side, holding her hand, telling her stories of their life together, reminding her of all the beautiful moments they'd shared. Their children gathered, along with many of the grandchildren, filling the cabin with quiet love and support. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, but in her lucid moments her eyes would find Quinn's and fill with love so profound it made his chest ache. "Don't be sad," she whispered one afternoon. "We had more than most people ever get. We had real love, true partnership. We had a beautiful life." "It's not enough," Quinn said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I want more time. I want forever." "We have forever," Eleanor assured him. "Love like ours doesn't end with death. It continues on in our children, in the legacy we've built. And someday we'll be together again. I believe that with my whole heart." "I love you, Eleanor Fletcher," Quinn said, his voice breaking. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you in Williamsburg, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Quinn Fletcher," Eleanor replied. "Thank you for choosing me." Thank you for the most beautiful life I could have imagined. Thank you for showing me that I was worth loving." She passed quietly that evening, surrounded by family, with Quinn holding her hand. Her last sight was of her husband's face, lined with age but still handsome to her, still beloved. Her last thought was of gratitude for the unexpected blessing that had been their life together. Quinn was devastated by the loss. For weeks, he barely spoke, merely going through the motions of living. His children worried about him, taking turns staying at the cabin to ensure he ate and cared for himself. But slowly, gradually, Quinn began to emerge from his grief. Not to forget Eleanor, he would never forget her, but to honor her memory by living the way she would have wanted him to. With joy, with gratitude, with appreciation for the beauty around him. He would sit on the porch every evening and talk to her, telling her about his day, sharing observations about the forest and their family. It brought him comfort to imagine she could hear him, to feel her presence in the wind through the pines and the song of the creek. On what would have been their 43rd wedding anniversary, Quinn sat on that familiar porch and spoke to Eleanor as if she sat beside him. "I miss you every moment of every day," he said. "But I'm grateful too. Grateful for every year, every day, every moment we had together. You made my life complete, Eleanor. You were the greatest gift I ever received." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Quinn felt a sense of peace settle over him. He'd had something precious, something rare. A love that transcended circumstances, that endured through decades, that would echo forward through generations. He'd married a woman with no dowry and gained everything that mattered. Quinn lived for 3 more years after Eleanor's passing, spending that time with his children and grandchildren, passing on his knowledge and wisdom. He told them stories about Eleanor, keeping her memory alive, ensuring that future generations would know about the remarkable woman who had been his wife. On a cool autumn morning in 1918, Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep, and his children found him with a smile on his weathered face, as if he'd seen something beautiful in his final moments. They buried him beside Eleanor on a hillside overlooking the valley, where the mountains rose majestically in the distance and the forest stretched endlessly in all directions. A simple marker noted their names and the years they'd lived, but more importantly, it noted their enduring love. Their cabin remained in the family for generations, each inhabitant adding their own stories to its history. But it was always known as Quinn and Eleanor's place, where a mountain man had married a woman with no dowry, and proved that the greatest wealth in life was love freely given and gratefully received. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew through the pines and the creek sang its eternal song, those who listened carefully might hear echoes of laughter, whispers of devotion, and the timeless story of a love that had changed everything. Because Eleanor Pritchard had brought herself to that marriage, and for Quinn Fletcher, it had been more than enough. It had been everything he'd ever needed, wrapped up in one brave, beautiful woman who'd taken a chance on a mountain man. And together, they'd built a life worth living, a love worth remembering, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.